Hi there. I want to talk today about both the factors that facilitate and limit political competition in Nigeria. We're going to start with the political party system. So one thing worth noting is that Nigeria political parties don't like emerge from nothing with the creation of the Fourth Republic in 1999. There has been kind of a fluctuating party system dating back to the late colonial period. As you probably know by now, as you could probably predict, because social cleavages are so important in Nigeria, because there is such an array of ethnic and religious and linguistic and cultural identities, during and after the colonial period, there's this strong tendency towards ethnic and regionally based parties. And that's not just a consequence of social cleavages, that also in the colonial period reflects the British administrative structures. Remember that the British are administering particularly northern and southern Nigeria largely separately, so it makes sense that, for instance, northerners are not going to have any particular reason to build a political party that has cross-national or cross-regional appeal. That said, there are some efforts in periods before the Fourth Republic to form nationwide cross-ethnic parties, in particular during the Second and Third Republics, those kind of brief little blips of democracy on the radar. You're going to have new regimes institute rules like the distribution requirement that are designed to require political parties to appeal to voters around the country. So those processes are in place before the Fourth Republic comes into being. Let's fast forward to the Fourth Republic, starting in 1999, continuing to the present day. A couple of things to note about the party system. Number one, in addition to the distribution requirement, in addition to the federal character principle, which are these formal aspects at the constitutional level of the regime that try to make sure that political parties are national, in addition, INEC, the National Election Commission, only certifies parties that are national and cross-ethnic. So if you want to be a party running for national office in Nigeria, INEC has to approve you before you can get your candidates on the ballot. And they look for a couple of things. For instance, you can't have any regional or ethnic names or symbols or references in the party name. You have to have membership open to all Nigerians, and you have to have offices in at least 24 of Nigeria's 36 states. So there are some safeguards designed to build, even before the level of people actually casting their ballots, there are some safeguards designed to encourage parties to actually have broad national appeal. We have basically a two-party system in Nigeria today. So two parties have actually succeeded at national elections in the last 20 years. The first is the People's Democratic Party. I'll talk a little bit more about the history of that when we get to elections in Nigeria. But that party in the Fourth Republic dominated elections from the first one in 1999 up through the presidential and legislative elections of 2011. So from 1999 to 2015, the PDP controls the presidency and also has majorities in both houses of the legislature. More recently, a second political party has become seriously competitive with the PDP. That's known as the APC, the All Progressives Congress. Again, I'll talk about the emergence of that party, but the short version is they come into being as a merger of other opposition parties under the presidency of Goodluck Jonathan, which is super controversial because he breaks that zoning norm that's been in place for a long time. And the APC's candidate, Muhammadu Buhari, actually succeeds in winning the presidency in 2015, gets reelected in 2019. So I think now it's pretty fair to say that Nigeria has a two-party system. One thing worth noting, you'll note that I didn't say anything about the ideology of either of those two major parties, and that's because it's just not super important. These parties are much more collections of elite patronage networks, of people who owe each other favors, of people who are kind of within each other's influence, rather than they are clear articulations of a particular ideology about how to run the state or how to run the economy. And so the ideological distinction between these two parties is just not nearly as important as the kind of personal connection factor. It's worth noting that there are some third parties competitive at the state level. The PDP and the APC don't control, for instance, 100% of state legislatures or 100% of seats in the national legislature, but those third parties don't yet appear to be seriously competitive in terms of nominating a presidential candidate or taking control of the National Assembly. One last thing worth noting is that Nigeria in the Fourth Republic has not yet had a divided government, meaning that it has not yet been the case that one party controls the presidency and a different party controls one or both houses of the legislature. So far since 1999, every election has returned a really decisive victory for either the PDP or the APC. And you can kind of imagine what that means in terms of legislative independence, in terms of the willingness of the legislature to get in the way of the president's agenda. That historically, as I've said before, has tended to be somewhat limited in the Fourth Republic. It's really difficult to talk completely about competitiveness of Nigerian politics without talking about corruption, and so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And I want to start you out with just some relevant vocabulary. Number one, patronage, as you've probably heard me say before, means the practice of dispensing state resources in exchange for political support, meaning that if I am elected president or if I become, I don't know, the secretary of the treasury or the postmaster general, I'm going to give out jobs to people who have supported me. I might give out state contracts. I might hire people to do work for the state using taxpayer money, based on not so much whether their bid is the lowest or their construction job is the best, but whether I want them to owe me a favor or something like that, whether they've politically supported me. I might, maybe provide my supporters with some way of skipping the line if they're trying to get access to, I don't know, state provided electricity or water. There's a bunch of different forms of patronage, but political patronage means that the state is giving out resources to its political supporters. This happens to some degree in every political system. It's pretty unavoidable. So in the United States, for instance, there's always some number of ambassadors appointed by an incoming president who have no political experience and instead are just major donors or major political supporters. But as a general rule of thumb, the more we see a political system rely on patronage, the less likely it is to be super competitive and super open and super democratic. Patronage often trades off with the level of democracy. Number two, and related to that, is the term corruption. And this is a term that I hear my students kind of overuse a lot to apply to basically any decision by a political figure that they disagree with. So I want to put a more precise definition out there for you. Political corruption is the misuse of public office for personal gain. If you are behaving corruptly as a political official, you have been given an office of public trust where you're supposed to be serving the people as a whole, and you're going to use that office in a way that benefits you personally. That might be just straight up stealing money from the treasury. That might be preferentially awarding contracts to, I don't know, your brother-in-law. Or it might mean dispensing patronage in a way that compromises the job that you're actually supposed to be doing for the taxpayers. Number three, a couple of terms that describe sort of higher levels of corruption. One is kleptocracy, which is an invented word meaning government by theft. It's not a real precise political term. It's not really a regime type. It's just a term that we often apply to countries that have higher levels of corruption, where we frequently see public officials engaging in behavior that is meant mostly to benefit themselves and their parties. Finally, prebendialism. This is a fancier term that was originally used in the context of, I think, medieval Europe, but was more recently, in maybe the 1960s, reappropriated by a Northwestern University political scientist named Richard Joseph to apply specifically to Nigeria. And by prebendialism, Joseph means the idea that public offices are sources of resources that should be distributed to supporters. So in other words, it's taking corruption and patronage and elevating them to the level of a norm. And what Joseph argues is that prebendialism is basically the defining political norm in Nigeria. He's done some subsequent work since the publication of his original book, whenever it was, arguing that prebendialism continues to characterize even democratic Nigeria. And it's just worth putting that out there because you might encounter that term in specific writings about corruption and patronage in the context of Nigerian politics. Sad to say, corruption is a really persistent feature of politics in Nigeria. There's an organization called Transparency International, you may have heard of this before, which every year ranks countries according to something called the Corruption Perception Index. In other words, they basically go around and ask citizens things like, have you been asked to pay a bribe to a public official in order to get a service last year? Has anyone asked you for a bribe in the last year? And Nigeria on that index consistently ranks in the bottom 25% of countries. It's generally the most corruptly perceived. It's the country in our course with the highest perceptions of corruption, where people perceive it to be the most corrupt. So this remains a really persistent feature of Nigerian politics, and it really pervades a lot of different aspects of citizens' interactions with the state. Why do we care? How does this affect politics? There's plenty of answers to this question. We'll probably talk about this more in class, but let me give you just a few different examples of why corruption matters for an AP Comp Gov course. Number one, it's pretty common for public officials in Nigeria to solicit and accept bribes. And again, this is true in other countries to some degree. There's no country that totally lacks corruption in the modern world, but levels are particularly high and notable in Nigeria. So I'm giving you data and also graphics from a 2019 report by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. I'll throw that links in the description of this video. But one thing that they found, for instance, is that they surveyed a bunch of people in Nigeria in 2019. They found that 63% of those people had had some contact with a government official in the last year, and that of those 63%, 30% of them had paid or been asked to pay a bribe by that public official. So those bribes might be for anything ranging from expediting the processing of a building permit, getting your electricity hooked up or turned back on faster, being able to kind of skip the line in order to see a doctor or a specialist at a state-run hospital, getting your kid preferential admission to school, lots and lots of different ways in which bribes are being paid or solicited in order to expedite access to services that should theoretically be available to all citizens equally. Number two, there's a fair amount of corrupt or nepotistic hiring, that is to say, hiring your family or friends for jobs in the public sector. And you might want to think back to our conversation about Nigeria's regime and see whether you think the federal character principle, which requires Nigerians from all states in Nigeria to be represented in the civil service, you might think whether the federal character principle is going to make that problem better or worse. Number three, for a long time, Nigeria has maintained this chunk of its budget called the excess crude account, which is basically where money goes when the oil price turns out to be higher than the government had planned on the oil price being for that year. So this is basically a really large fund of money, which until somewhat recently has been pretty easy for politicians to be able to just distribute without a whole lot of accountability. And often that chunk of money turns out to be a source of patronage, of bribes, and you tend to see it getting spent down really aggressively in the run-up to an election as politicians try and bribe their supporters. Finally, number four, it's pretty common, as I think I mentioned when we talked about elections in the regime lecture, it's pretty common for Nigerians to be either asked to sell their vote or to actually accept some sort of payment in exchange for casting their vote. And that same 2019 UN report that I've been citing says that 20% of Nigerians in the 2019 election of their survey sample were offered money or something else of value in exchange for casting their vote for a particular party or a particular candidate. As I think I've said before, this is so prevalent that INEC, the National Election Commission, has actually put out a music video titled "Don't Sell Your Vote." Super catchy. Highly recommend that you watch it if you haven't already. That in mind, let's talk a little bit about elections, a fundamental aspect of competition in Nigeria. Elections, like political parties, are not brand new in 1999. There have been a number of attempts in Nigeria's post-independence history where military governments have sponsored at least somewhat genuinely competitive nationwide elections, where they have actually said, we don't want to rule by force, we don't want to rule by coup d'etat forever, we think the people should actually express some degree of preference in who's going to govern them. And so that happened in 1979, that happened in 1993, it happened in 1999, where a military regime said, actually, we're going to hold elections and transition to a more democratic regime. There are coup d'etat after the 79 and 93 elections relatively quickly, and those end the second and third republics respectively. But the 1999 election is different and worth spending a little bit of time on, because so far that transition to electoral democracy has stuck longer than the previous 2 or 3 experiments in Nigerian history. Going into the 1999 election, there were 3 major political parties, and they basically corresponded to the 3 major regions and the 3 major ethnic groups of Nigeria. So there's a northern party representing predominantly the House of Fulani people. There's a southwestern party representing primarily the Yoruba people. And then there's a southeastern party representing primarily the Igbo people. But then something weird happens. The People's Democratic Party, which is based in the north, has strong support from military officers, among whom Muslim northerners tend to be somewhat overrepresented. The PDP nominates a military officer and a former military ruler named Olusegun Obasanjo, who is a Yoruba Christian from the south. So this is kind of contrary to expectations and is going to draw a bunch of northern voters into voting for the southern candidate. Obasanjo wins that election resoundingly. He gets something like 2/3 of the votes, and the election is not perfect. It is not totally free of fraud or violence, but the results are pretty much widely accepted. And Obasanjo goes on to win re-election in 2003 and to serve out 8 terms as the more or less duly elected president of Nigeria. So it's worth thinking about the 99 election as an example of a time when democratization actually works. The military says, all right, we're going to try out this electoral democracy thing, and the people, by and large, accept the results. Let's fast forward then to 2015, which is another pivotal election where the party system is actually going to change. So the PDP's candidate, and remember that up until this point, the PDP has won every presidential election since the beginning of the Fourth Republic, is once again Goodluck Jonathan. You may remember him as Guy with Cool Hat. Goodluck Jonathan is the incumbent president. You remember he comes to office initially in 2010 as the vice president to Umaru Yar'Adua. Yar'Adua is a northern Muslim. Jonathan is a Southern Christian. Remember, that's in keeping so far with the zoning system that's been informally established by the PDP, where there's going to be alternation of power between a Northerner and a Southerner. But then in 2011, instead of stepping down, instead of handing back the PDP's nomination to a Northern Muslim candidate, Jonathan is going to run and fill out his entire term in 2011. And then in 2015, he's going to do it again. And this is going to arouse even more controversy because it's seen as Jonathan taking too much power into his own hands and trying to upend that zoning system that previously had guaranteed at least some degree of power sharing or balance of power between Northerners and Southerners. So this kind of controversial decision by Jonathan to run again is going to spur all of the major opposition parties, or at least 3 of the biggest opposition parties rather, to join forces to create this thing called the All Progressives Congress that's established in 2013. Later, a number of people will defect from the PDP, say Goodluck Jonathan has gone too far, and they'll try and form their own new PDP, but eventually they're going to join the APC too. The APC's candidate, Muhammadu Buhari, wins the 2015 election, and the APC is also going to win majorities in both the House and the Senate. So this is the first time that a non-PDP party has won control of the executive and or the legislature in the post-1999 Nigeria in the Fourth Republic. This is a significant transition. And if you're keeping track on a democracy scorecard, it's probably a good sign that Nigeria is not, unlike Mexico, going to undergo a long period of single-party rule. Couple things to note in terms of both democratic and non-democratic features of Nigeria's election. One major concern for people who are kind of hoping that Nigeria will transition into a consolidated democracy is ongoing high levels of post-election violence. It's not particularly uncommon before and after presidential elections in Nigeria to see a variety of incidents of politically related, election-related violence around the country between parties and sometimes also between members of ethnic groups. At the local level, even though the major parties are national and cross-ethnic and cross-regional, it's not at all unusual at the local level to see politicians kind of stoking ethnic resentments and fears and tensions and stereotypes in order to get their supporters excited to go to the polls. And sometimes in various regions, that leads to violence before and after the election. So that kind of security situation is an ongoing compromised level of democracy in Nigeria. There's been, however, a couple of recent steps toward democratization, both of which actually happened under Goodluck Jonathan, that are positive signs for people who are cheering for Nigeria to become more democratic. One is reforms at INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, which is the body that oversees Nigeria's elections. We talked about that when we talked about the regime as well. In 2010, the incumbent head of INEC is widely regarded as fairly corrupt, and Goodluck Jonathan actually fires that guy and replaces him with a much more widely respected academic. That guy's going to go on and introduce a bunch of reforms to INEC. Notably, he's going to have a national fingerprinting program, so voters, there's something like 73 million voters at this time, I think, in Nigeria, who are going to go get their fingerprints taken and recorded so that they can confirm their identity when they go to the polls to vote. You can see in the background of this slide people holding up ID cards that they're also going to be asked to present at the polls as well. He also introduces some other reforms, such as more transparent processes for counting the votes that are generally going to enhance people's faith that the elections are actually going to be credible and not just rigged in favor of the incumbent party. And so when Jonathan goes on to win that election, the result is regarded as somewhat more credible. The other major reform that helps is under Goodluck Jonathan after that 2011 election, the government's going to create a new organization called the NSIA, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority. This is a body which is created to manage some of that excess oil revenue that had gone in the excess crude account. And the idea there is that this is an independent body which will be able to invest extra oil money in economic development and in making people's lives better, taking some of that control away from the various politicians who would dip into that fund to just pay massive bribes to their supporters in the run up to the election. That's not to say that the problem of vote buying in Nigeria, as we've already seen, has completely gone away. That's not the case. But it is an important step towards making sure that those revenues are spent in a more accountable and less corrupt manner. Last thing to note, civil society in Nigeria. In many ways, the development of civil society has preceded the development of electoral democracy in Nigeria. So even going back to the colonial period and even through the periods of military rule, Nigeria has had a vibrant civil society. There's a lot of different, voluntary citizen associations based on profession, based on ethnicity, based on religion. There's a lot of different formal and informally organized interest groups. During various periods of military rule, we've seen suppression applied to civil society. We've seen more or fewer restrictions on civil society. But Nigerians have for a long time been really actively organizing themselves in order to influence the direction of politics in their country. And this is a factor which is going to help encourage democratization, particularly after the demise of Sani Abacha. One place where civil society is particularly important and where unusually the College Board actually is going to name two civil society organizations that you're supposed to know is the Niger Delta. This is the region in the south of Nigeria where the Niger River empties out into the Atlantic Ocean. It's really ethnically diverse. It's kind of cut up by the river and its various branches. And so this is going to produce a really ethnically and linguistically diverse region. And it's also the place where most of the oil in Nigeria is produced. And so this means that tensions over the environmental and the economic impacts of oil production, and particularly over whether foreign oil companies are behaving responsibly and accountably to the people of Nigeria, those issues are super, super important and often very inflammatory in the Niger Delta region. So two civil society organizations in this area that it's important that you want to know about because they represent kind of contrasting approaches to the problem of how to get your government to do what you want them to do. The first is a group which is very, very active in the 1990s, particularly under the government of Sani Abacha, a military dictator, called MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. The Ogoni are an ethnic minority concentrated in the Niger Delta who have been really, really heavily impacted by the negative environmental impacts of oil production. And so in the 1990s, MOSOP starts organizing itself to try and hold both the governments and foreign oil companies, particularly Shell, to account for what they believe as is abusive behavior or neglectful behavior surrounding the extraction of oil in that region. They operate nonviolently, although not always legally, and they're really persecuted by the Abacha government, culminating in the 1994 execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni activists. This is, as you'll recall, one of the events which really crystallizes international and domestic public opinion against the Abacha government. Movement number 2 is called MEND, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. This one's a little fuzzier and harder to pin down because it's kind of an umbrella group for a bunch of different militant organizations. But overall, the groups that are affiliated with MEND represent a very different perspective about what to do when you don't like the way oil extraction is happening, because they use violent and illegal means. They'll sabotage oil production, they'll destroy pipelines and try and extract the oil. That's a practice known as bunkering. They'll sometimes kidnap foreign oil workers. They'll sabotage various oil facilities. This has presented a significant, it's created a good deal of environmental as well as economic damage in the Niger Delta region. And different governments have taken different approaches to negotiating with MEND. In 2009, the Yar'Adua government signed a truce and gave an amnesty to members of MEND. But because it's not a tightly organized group, some of its affiliated militant groups still continued their attacks on oil production. And there's some other unaffiliated militant groups that have since emerged in the region. So that situation continues to be pretty inflammatory, continues to be somewhat violent and somewhat dangerous, although it's not, I think, the violence has died down to some degree, particularly since your textbook was written if you have the green edition. One last thing to note about Nigeria is that there is a really free and active media sector. This is actually one of the freer medias of our case study countries, particularly if you compare with countries like China or Russia or Iran. There's a really extensive and vibrant media sector, and it's just worth noting this is another positive sign for democracy and a source of pressure on the country to continue democratizing and to continue becoming more transparent. That's it. I will leave it there. Thanks.